Hello everyone. So we're going to start very simple. First, we're going to tape out our paper. So I have a hot pressed piece of paper here, so it's very smooth, and I'm going to lay tape all along very smooth, all of the edges. You don't want any little wrinkles in it or anything because the water will get underneath it. So I'm making sure it's pressed down. I like to overlap my corners because it makes it a little easier to pull it up when the time comes for that. Always making sure it's pressed down on the paper. I use masking tape because it usually comes up pretty easily. There are some brands that are extra sticky, so kind of try it on a little corner before you do. I'm also, as I'm going around, you can see kind of trying to keep the same amount underneath the tape in a straight line. On this one, I get a little wrinkle down at the bottom there, so I'm going to pull it up very carefully, get a straight, clean line. Just makes everything look more crisp when we're done. So next we're going to start painting. I'm just going to go over some basic washes today, so that you can start your very first project with your watercolors. So I'm going to use these two pointed round brushes. I've got my palette there and water, of course. So here we go. So I'm going to draw kind of a loose shape here. This is our blending practice. And the first thing we're going to look at is wet blending. So it sounds like it is. You blend water with water. Everything is wet while you're doing it. So I'm going to put out some of the ultramarine, use some of the same color, I hope, or something close if you wanted to try to paint along, but you could use any color. Pre-soaking a couple of my little palettes there. All right, so with ultramarine, you can see I've got it pretty saturated. I'm just going to show you how you can pull out from that. So there's pretty saturated, and with a back and forth sort of sweeping motion and more water, I'm able to pull out. Once it's wet, if that corner is, I want more saturation in it, I can dip back into the paint and apply it into the water. You can see there's sort of standing water. You're seeing the reflection of it, and as long as there's standing water, everything's going to move, everything's going to blend. So I'm going to draw a little rectangle just to sort of practice inside this. We're going to start with a pretty high saturation of this ultramarine up on the top. And see, I'm dipping my paintbrush, but I'm not like wiping it off, so I'm letting it stay very wet, kind of banging off any dripping water, but it's a very damp paintbrush, and then using a back and forth motion to pull out from that high saturation area into a lower saturation area. You can see I've sort of pre-wet it before I pull out into it, which helps the paint and pigment move easier. So we're going to do a bit of a mix here, so adding some of that lemon yellow down on the bottom, and then I'm going to pull out from it going the other direction, and they will mix in the middle. This is just a good first practice if you haven't had much to do with them before, just seeing how smooth you can get that gradient from one to the other. So wet blending is a great technique for soft edges and soft gradients. It can be hard to get really firm detail in because as soon as your pigment touches water, it spreads out, right? So that back and forth motion is really helpful, and a drier brush. So if it's really wet and everything's moving too much, you can dry off your brush or bang it off, or use your rag to really just take all the moisture out so you're not continually adding more water. Down here I want it to be a little lighter, so I use my rag to pick up a little bit of color or a little bit of water, so that then I have more room to mix in saturation at the bottom here. So saturation is literally just percentage of pigment to water, right? So if I've got too much water on the page, then it's going to be hard for me to keep bumping up the color. So sometimes it's worth it to just blot the water off so that you don't have so much medium that you're fighting with. And you can see what I'm trying to do here is get that bottom as saturated as this yellow pigment looks on my palette. Thing about watercolors is they dry lighter than they look when you put them down, which you will see as these dry. So here we're doing a little bit of wet technique where I laid all the water down first. It's hard to see that on a video, I'm sorry. But then I'm just using the point of my paintbrush to just add pigment into it and then stirring in this like standing pool of water, which gets you some beautiful organic edges. It's a nice way if you're like terrified of adding pigment next to something to do it with clear water, and then you can always pick it up if it goes somewhere you don't want, but that way it will, like, the pigment's not going to go further than the water you already laid down. Then here I'm just letting little drops of blue bloom in it. It's kind of mixing, and then I can choose if I want to mix that color together or pull it out from this edge here. So if I let it dry with those just standing, it would be sort of a mottled finish. If I mix it up while it's standing in the water, then you're going to get a much smoother gradient shift, okay? So those are all examples of wet blending. We're going to jump over here and do a little quick version of some dry blending, which, you guessed it, means that the different layers are dried in between, adding water on top of them. So we're going to do very similar, same color. We're going to aim to do the same mix but with dry layering. So I've got a triangle or a rectangle here, and I'm going to sort of fill it in on one side from corner to corner on the diagonal with a bit of a gradient. So I'm going to let that dry. I'm using my blow dryer. I'm holding it with a very low power until it's all dry. You can run your hand over it, nothing moves, okay? Now we're going to add the yellow on top of it. So technically the paint colors aren't mixing, but you can see they're still creating a nice green tone in the middle. This is called optical blending or dry blending. It's when our eye actually is combining the colors as they layer. So it's not mixing the paint, it's allowing them to mix dry on the page. Dry blending is a really great way to do details. It's excellent for going back in and popping up some saturation. So as you can see, these dried all around a little lighter than they were when they were wet. So you can use, another pass over them always. Watercolor is reworkable for like infinite times. So here you can see I can pop back in and do a little bit of another layer, like a dry layer on top of it, and mix my saturation a little higher so it's a little poppier. You'll see a lot of that back and forth sweeping motion. That's a great way to keep adding water to your brush and keep sweeping, and it'll create a nice gradient for you. So I'm going to make a little square up here of standing water and then let it sit for a minute to create what we call suede wet on the paper. So it's when it soaks into the paper, but it's no longer standing water. So standing water gets these big kind of blurry edges. Suede is a little medium between wet blending and dry blending. So for your sketchbook this week, you need to do some saturation only shading. So I'm going to do an example of it here. I think you're doing like a cube and a sphere. So we'll do a cube. So with only one color, I want you to use different types of saturation to define light. So no mixing other colors in, just using how much water is in it to make shadows and highlights. So I'm using my Alzerian Crimson, laying it in pretty heavily on this side because that's our non-lit side based on my cast shadow I drew in there. Now when you're doing these little cubes especially, you'll see I leave a little edge of white in between, well, unless I get my head in the way, in between the two sides, because if they do touch, see how it's sort of blooming out there on the edge, which is what will happen. Like if there's an area with more pigment next to an area with less pigment, the pigment's going to like blur into it unless they don't quite touch. So I just picked that little blur up with my rag so that it doesn't continue to make it worse. So the top is the lightest area. Get a little wash in there, pick up a little bit if it got too dark on us. Now we'll work on adding a little more saturation down on this side and in this corner. So there's three very definite sides with definite hues, or shades. Hue is color. So now we're going to work on the cast shadow, which is usually the darkest, and that lightens as it gets away from the form, right? So the cast shadow doesn't have as much of like sides, it's more of one huge silhouette. And it has a little bit of a gradient in it, okay? So that's what I want you to practice with those shapes, and you can see them in the printout, the handout from last week and week 1. These shapes are in there. So some basic blending. We're gonna hop up here and look at that Suede wet section. We're gonna go over blending a lot more next week. We try not to overwhelm y'all at once with 50 different techniques. So up here, my Suede wet got a little drier than I want, so I'm just gonna put in just a touch more water and let it sit for a second. Now you can see when something is Suede wet that you get kind of a bloom, but it's not, it gets these beautiful soft edges, but you don't lose saturation as fast. It does still like grow. You can see how my paint is like continually mixing out into the water. But you can get, by pre-wetting your paper like that before you apply pigment, you can get really solid, soft colors without any blurs or paint strokes or anything. So that's what's useful for that. I do want to show you what the edges will look like if you go up to them with paint. So this is why we tape out, right? So just did a quick little one, we blow dry it. And then if we peel up the tape, make sure you do it at this like 45-degree angle, pulled back on itself, right? That's the easiest way to do it. And then it will peel up very nicely and you'll leave these crisp little white edges. That black smudge was already there. All right, see you on the next one.